right, everybody. So I guess we can go ahead and get started. My name is Hannah, and I am one of the co-leaders of Student Congress. This teacher talk series is a series. We have about one every month, and it's hosted by the academic committee of the Student Congress. And yeah, Student Congress is a student-led organization, and we do advocacy work on campus. If anybody is interested in getting involved in Student Congress, I'm going to put our email and our Instagram page in the chat. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about involvement or anything in general. We're definitely happy to, chat and answer any questions you may have. So on that, I'll pass it off to Jillian. Jillian is one of our committee leads for the Student Engagement Committee, and she will be facilitating this teacher talk today. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Hi, everyone. Like Hannah said, my name is Jillian, and I am the leader of the Student Congress Student Engagement Committee. And I'm also an MSW student, normally at the Lincoln Center campus, and I'm graduating in May 2022. And thank you so much for coming today. I think this is going to be a really great event. We have Professor David Koch and Professor Nicholas Santo here to talk about social work practice with LGBTQ plus clients. And we figured that they could kind of introduce themselves through the first question that I'm going to ask them. So I'll let them kind of do that. And also I wanted to note as well that we're going to leave 15 minutes at the end of this event for Q&A. So during that time, you can put questions in the chat or unmute yourself and feel free to engage with us. So our first question is, could you tell us a bit about how you got interested in doing clinical work with the LGBTQ plus community and give us a brief overview of the work you have done? So whoever would like to go first can jump in.
Okay, well, I've been thinking about LGBT, or I had been thinking about LGBT issues for a very long time. Prior to starting the class. Growing up in rural California and going to UC Berkeley was a kind of a shock, but it kind of gave me the opportunity to start the process, of coming out, and so coming out was a very big deal when you come from a small rural town in the 1960s in California. And it was really a gradual process of realization that this is something important for me to really come to terms with. And so that became much more increasingly active and became involved in trying to kind of push for advocacy within the LGBTQ community, even back then. Coming to New York, I got my doctorate in psychology and then my MSW. And I've been involved in clinical work ever since at the William Alanson White Institute of Psychotherapy and Psychoanalysis. But I've always had a very strong involvement in LGBT kinds of issues, and kind of particularly the issues that surround feelings of shame and feelings of vulnerability, and trying to work through some of those issues. And we can continue, and certainly I'm responsive to questions, but I think I'll pass it over to Nick and see what he wants to talk to.
Hi. Similarly, I think I've always had an interest in working with, well, particularly, I'll say more specifically, gay-related issues. I am a gay identifying male. I really didn't start coming to terms, I think, with my own identity until college, and that's where I really started to kind of explore like the world of like flags, so Friends of Lesbians and Gays. I partnered with like local parents of friends and lesbians and gays at the time, and this was early 2000s. Before I was even thinking about clinical work, it was more about advocacy and support. And that was mostly throughout my undergraduate career. And then when I moved on to my graduate career, I actually partnered with Dr. Koch to do a support group for LGBTQI identifying people at Fordham as a graduate student. And right after that, my first job out of graduate school, I worked in a homeless shelter for women. It was transitional housing. So it was people were coming there from like the street into like a temporary home. And our goal was to move them onward to permanent housing. And I think one of the most profound experiences I've had was when we had our first trans female on site, and nobody knew what to do. There was a lot of questions about what would be most appropriate, and kind of handling the situation, how to manage people's emotions and thoughts and reactions regarding a trans female in the shelter, and clients in the shelter and so on. So I think from that point on, I think this is before I moved into private practice, I started to realize that I wanted to dive much deeper into the LGBTQI experiences. And I say that, I emphasize that because there's not, just more specifically, there's not one experience. And I think of LGBTQ life experiences, I guess. I'll end there.
Thank you so much for your responses. And I guess those are really good introductions too. So we can go on to the next question, which is, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing the LGBTQ plus clients that you work with? And how does intersectionality affect these clients and the challenges they face?
David, do you mind if I jump in on that? Because I feel like first.
After you. I mean,
okay.
I'll jump in. Yeah.
Okay. So I just I've been writing a lot on intersectionality. So I started my doctoral career in 2018, and I'm hopefully, fingers crossed, I finish come this May. So that's kind of exciting. But a lot of my work and a lot of my focus has been on intersectionality and LGBTQI identifying people. But so some of I think the things that have come to my awareness, and I think has been coming to like a greater awareness more in like also mainstream discussion, is not just like singular identities and stress, but like minority stress in the sense of like either dual minority stress or even multiple minority stress. Like we have various identities that we want to be focusing on, and experiences of people, right? That it's never just one particular thing. And so I think, what was the question again? So some of the biggest challenges, I think, when we have harassment and suicide and suicidality, and access to care, access to culturally competent and affirmative care for LGBTQ identifying people. Yeah, so I just in a nutshell, kind of that's a bit of what I find some of the biggest challenges.
Well, I mean, should I jump in? I guess I will.
Please,
I mean, intersectionality and positionality is sort of key in understanding that we as social workers are very interested in creating a context. And one of the main contexts is really understanding issues of how race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality kind of inform, the kind of work that we do and how we provide contact and care. And so really being very attentive to that issue of intersectionality is central. It can really affect it tremendously because different cultural kinds of issues come to bear in terms of levels of oppression that get played out, in terms of how available resources are and how do people kind of feel about about their sexuality and about their gender. One of the things that I think is really central is stage of life. One of the things that I cover in my LGBT class is people in their 70s and 80s now grew up in an era where it was anathema to be gay or lesbian, let alone trans. And that those kinds of issues get played out in the context of oppression tremendously. So that somebody who's going in perhaps to assisted living or nursing home kinds of settings oftentimes grew up in an era that was really hard, and hard for themselves to come to terms with their own sexual orientation or gender nonconforming behavior, but also kind of really feeling like they may not get served. And it's very, very common, or had been very common. Maybe things have changed, I think, because of the timeliness of the work that we're doing in education. But it was not uncommon for a person to go into an assisted living setting and be devalued for their sexual orientation, to be rendered invisible. I'm struck by a professor who talked to me about this back in the 1980s, and she was out as a lesbian at a university in the metropolitan area, and then she retired and went to another state with her then partner, who passed away, so that she was alone, and she was older. She was 70s, mid 70s, and she went into an assisted living facility, and she went back in the closet because she didn't feel safe. And I think that the contextualizing intersectionality means looking at issues of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, but also stage of life. And that people in the 1950s, young people in the 1950s, are now in retirement or post-retirement age and have to contend with levels of oppression, that are really very hard. And that, in fact, maybe we as practitioners can be very aware of that and provide a kind of a counter force to that level of oppression. Period.
Thank you. I think these are great points. And considering how older age affects LGBTQ individuals, I think is an important point that doesn't get mentioned as often. And considering like when people grew up and what the society and culture was like at that time, and how it affected the oppression they experienced, I think is a really good point. So our next question is, I saw that both of you have listed experience working with adolescents on your websites. Could you tell us a bit about working with LGBTQ plus adolescents and how that may differ from working with LGBTQ plus adults?
I'm throwing it to you, Nick, to start.
Me first? Okay. Well, a few things as far as adolescent work. I think that one of the things I go to, I think, immediately is to assess for supports in this person's life. Who do they see as a safe, secure person that they can go to, speak to, and not necessarily come out to, but just more of who are the people in their lives that are essentially that they see as strong caregivers, right? And I do that for a number of reasons. One, I think, is we assessing for safety. Like if the adolescent person is wants to come out or does come out, what is the level of safety? I want to get a sense of who's around them, what their living situation is like, and so on. That doesn't mean we shouldn't and can't do that for adults. I think that it's a little bit different. I think that adolescents don't have the opportunity or the resources to care for themselves in certain ways if they're rejected by or have to run away from a threatening or harmful situation. So there's that. I try to, when working with adolescents, I do try, if they're coming out or have come out, I try to incorporate family work in some capacity. And leave the autonomy and the decision making to that person, to the adolescent, not immediately to the family. What is gauge and assess their comfort level, and work family work into that as we need to move forward. And I think the other piece here is that we have to also pay attention to social media. And how that impacts the lives of adolescents and how much it's woven into the very fabric of their development, and understanding what role that plays in their development and in their day-to-day lives, because it can go in a number of directions, right? It can be their greatest support, or it could be very extremely detrimental to their identity and sense of self and valuing of self. you know, as I say that now, I'm starting to, I mean, I realize that social media and internet and all this is a part of all of our lives. But there is an entire generation of youth that only know this. And so just paying attention to that. And David's point earlier about stage of life, I think is really important also, because obviously, when you're speaking about stage of life and understanding people's experiences through that context, or adding that into the intersectional context. You know, I'm thinking of, you know, clients I have currently who are, you know, in their 60s and early 70s, and the sense of feeling devalued has been emerging a lot more, I think, nowadays as well. Particularly when they're feeling there's less access to, I guess, age-appropriate care and understanding, but also, you know, I have one client who I'm thinking of specifically who still is very cautious about bringing up his, you know, his sexual activity to certain providers in fear of retaliation or fear of rejection or shaming. So I know I kind of deviated a little bit but that is a bit of a difference one difference between working with adolescents and adults.
You know, I echo a lot of what Nick is saying, and I really I mean, even the very beginning of the clinical relationship, it's kind of like it's a process and a conversation. So I'm not pressing, I'm not leaning into the conversation by assuming that somebody is, you know, even if they talk about being about gay or lesbian or bi issues, I'm not making assumptions, and I kind of take it as a conversation. And oftentimes people's coming out experiences are more gradual. You know, they may not be coming out. They may in fact feel quite uncomfortable coming out, you know, and so I have to be very attentive. My job isn't really to push for coming out at all. Even though, of course, like Nick was saying, I would probably want to assess for resources, so and support and safety. One of the statistics that's most scary is the kind of violence that one sees. I'm closing this Adobe thing, doesn't want to close. The level of violence that's directed towards trans women of color, and particularly young trans women of color who are coming to understand their sexual, you know, their gender and sexual kinds of issues, and that frequently get there's a lot of potential violence and death, you know, as a result of that. And it's kind of our role as clinicians is how do you start to work with that? How do you start to kind of intervene where necessary, so that in fact that can be something that we can kind of have a more positive impact on. There's so much you could say about, you know, about how you work with teenagers. I mean, I worked with a young trans boy, you know, and the kind of relationship was very powerful. And what made it even more powerful was his difficulty in coming to terms with his trans identity and the gradual process with which it took. You know, that it wasn't a kind of a done deal. It was an emerging process. You know, and I think if we as clinicians kind of assume that it will be an emerging process, and in fact, other things may come to the fore, you know, that may in fact be very important. Issues of depression or anxiety, other issues may come to the foreground that, you know, but that behind it, there may be sexual and gender issues that we need to take into account in terms of our work. I think there's a lot more that could be said, but that might be a good place for me to stop.
I mean, I agree with you, David, on that. I think in particular, it's the part of the competency in the affirmative in affirmative care also is understanding when and where sexual and gender identity issues are appropriate to be addressed, or and not to push on them, or to kind of completely draw them out in a way that's I think either jarring or just the wrong time, right? I think it's knowing how and when to I guess kind of finesse and kind of draw on those issues because they are delicate topics, I think, for many people. You know, I have I think I remember I'm thinking of one person in particular who trans-identifying male, and that was never an issue for him. He's as I'm told, right? And so, you know, that he had a lot of support from family, from friends, and it was a very positive process for him. There was a period of childhood where it was not, but that was off limits, that conversation. And so it is an emerging process of how those experiences, I think, will come up and when they come up, and allowing the person that you're working with to bring it to the table as needed.
That's interesting. It brings up a person that I was working with for 3 years. He was very comfortable with his homosexuality. He came out early, like at 16, 17, went into an affirming college environment, and everything seemed fine. But what wasn't fine was his feeling about his gender presentation. He felt that he was feminine appearing as a man, and he felt tremendous shame as a result of that. And so the issues that we dealt with, I sort of stumbled into it, because the sexual orientation was not a big problem in terms of his feeling pretty identified with being gay and feeling kind of like he was getting what he could from the university and from the college and from his job. He didn't feel at all a problem, but he really felt tremendously shamed when he'd get a phone call and pick up the phone and somebody would misgender him, as a female, even though he was a man and identified as a man. And so he felt tremendous levels of shame. And so it became the task, is how to work through that shame, to kind of understand where you go with that, and that was in some ways unanticipated. We fell into it, sort of, and I didn't really at first glance know where we go, but you discover where to go after you work with somebody for some time, because it is a relationship that you're developing with someone, and out of this relationship comes a deepened sense of, what are the issues that need to be kind of dealt with.
Yeah, I think these are great points about how important it is to not make assumptions about how someone has been affected by their gender identity or sexual orientation and that experience for them, or even to make assumptions about like what those identities mean to that person. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. So our next question is, what are your recommendations for social workers who work with or would like to work with LGBTQ plus clients, but do not identify as LGBTQ plus themselves?
I guess I don't see why a person needs to kind of, be identified as part of the community in order to work with somebody that's LGBT themselves. I mean, I don't know that that's really something that I would presume. I think what it does bring up is it brings up issues of countertransference and transference, that in fact, what does the client feel about me as a clinician? It does bring up an interesting point for me, which is I'm an out gay therapist if a person wants me to be, if a person wants that. So if a person gets a referral and they want to talk to a gay therapist, I'm perfectly amenable to doing that, being in that role, because I am gay and feel comfortable in that role. But I don't necessarily share that with every client. It isn't something that kind of comes in on the first day of treatment. I'm Dr. Koch, I'm David Koch, and I'm gay. It isn't really necessarily what I would lead with. I mean, it may or may not come into the work at all. It may not be the issue. If it does come up, it certainly is something that we can talk about. It may not be what I may not disclose that, depending on what's going on between me and the client, and what the transference might be like. It may determine whether I disclose my sexuality. But I think that if you're a cisgender heterosexual therapist, it doesn't mean that you can't work with gay or lesbian clients. I think you need to be prepared that they may read into you issues of sexuality and gender. They may see you as wanting you to kind of be a support in that direction. They may wonder about your sexuality or your gender identification, and that's, I think it brings up issues about how you manage or understand your own sexuality, and feel some comfort in being able to understand the countertransference that might be elicited by somebody that assumes that you're working with me, you're probably a lesbian, and I'm a lesbian. That's great, and makes me feel very close to you, et cetera. So, but that may not, like, what do you do with that? One of the things you don't do is you don't kind of put that down. You don't kind of come out and say, well, don't get me wrong, I'm not a gay or lesbian. You work with where the client's at and try to understand where there can be some room or some movement that can help to move the relationship deeper, and to kind of help with the developing authenticity and genuineness and kind of a real kind of sense of self. So that doesn't mean you have to be a gay or lesbian therapist. You can be kind of a therapist, I guess is what my point is. Nick, did you want to say anything about that, or?
I mean, you've neatly summed up, I think, what I want to say and what I've been writing about. So I think that, ultimately, is that you just as a gay identifying therapist, also, that doesn't make me an expert in all things gay, right, either. And so I think a lot of this is about self-reflection, the counter transference issues that might be coming up, or just kind of that experiential kind of call it kind of the intersubjective experience between the two people in the room, and that building of that relationship. And part of the therapeutic relationship is creating a sense of safety and security to talk about really challenging and difficult things. And if a person's sexual or gender identity is part of that topic, or one of those topics, then you create that space to do that, to do as much. And so I hear a lot of anxiety, I think, in that question. I think, and about, like, what do I do if I'm not LGBTQ identifying, right? How do I relate? How do I connect, right? Well, in a very human way, right? You get curious about that person's experience, but also get curious about your own experience and your understanding, and pay attention to biases, right? Are there any biases that might be coming up for you in the moment that you might not be expressing, but do cross your mind, right? And look into that, both on just like a personal reflective level, but your research, conversations with people, supervision.
Using a supervisor to help you to understand your own countertransference that might surround the LGBT issues that are emerging in the room. If a person wants you to be lesbian or gay and you're not, that doesn't make you less of an effective practitioner unless you have trouble kind of reconciling that. That you're not lesbian or gay, but are working with a lesbian, gay, or trans client. I mean, that to me would be something that would speak to getting, or participating in really good supervision to sort out what are the issues for yourself, that are making this a difficult or fraught kind of situation, seems like. I'm sorry, I cut you off, Nick. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. No, I'm good.
Thank you. Yeah, those are really good suggestions. And I think it brings up the point too, that obviously we always are going to be working with clients who have different identities than us, whether it's like race, gender, sexuality. And I think those are good points for any of those types of identity differences. And our last question is, are there any issues that clients of particular LGBTQ plus identities and other intersectional identities often experience that you would like to highlight, maybe issues that new social workers might not be aware of?
A ton. I mean, there's a lot, that we as practitioners need to be continually kind of learning and being involved in. I think that there's a whole set of issues that surround, identities having to do with drugs and alcohol and sexuality and the role that they play in one's clinical, in one's life, and how that can be understood for us as clinicians. I'm just saying there's so many areas that that are up and coming, areas. Nick, do you want to throw out a couple and then I'll join you, or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things I think have been coming up, I think in particular in my sessions has been like this could very well be because of the people who kind of are either drawn to my profile or refer to me for very specific reasons, right? So I just want to maybe kind of highlight that. But a lot of my new cases that I've taken on, and a few people I've been working with, we've been talking a lot about kind of heteronormativity and certain standards being kind of thrust upon people. And I'm going to say this, and this is in terms of age, is that the age ranges varied. It wasn't like a particular age group where it felt like we were talking about this particular topic. So that's one thing. I think I think David is correct, is that there's so many things that will come up and emerge over time and become, come to our awareness. But very topically and very politically, violence against Asian and Asian American people. I've been talking about this with my Asian American clients for years. And so it's not a new topic. I think what changes, I think, is not necessarily the topics, is maybe sometimes the intensity or the awareness or the social awareness of particular topics. And so, and how it affects our clients and their identity and their feelings of self-worth and their feelings of safety. I had a very powerful and I think really emotional session yesterday with one of my clients who is bisexual and Asian American identifying, and hearing her experience, it was heartbreaking. Kind of how this what's going on today. It's not new to her. It's just more in her face. And the way she's kind of described it, and it's been, I think the topic that has been coming up with, and our relationship was both one, identifying our differences, right? Me being a male walking around in the society, and who I am, my race, ethnicity, and kind of how and certain privileges that come along with that, and how she experiences the world very, very differently just by walking out her door. And when she described to me what that was like to her, it was just really, really powerful. And I think, so I think, not to bookend this or anything, but to go back to what David was saying earlier, is that we just be ready for what comes your way, listen attentively, and attune to that person's experience in that moment, what they're bringing to the table, and certain things will emerge. And in this case, when I'm speaking of, I didn't bring up her race, ethnicity, or sexual or gender identity at all. It's something that just came out of our discussions with what was going on in the world around her. We weren't even working on those things prior to 3 weeks ago. So I think it's, even your work with people will change and evolve over time, and session to session, and trying to, I think, even give yourself permission to go with the flow a little bit, right? Pump the brakes. You're not going to have all the answers either.
I think that's great to think about that, is that we don't have all the answers, but what we do have is a capacity to really kind of co-create a relationship with our clients, to really be able to search and get inquisitive and curious about what's getting in the way of understanding oneself, to really kind of look at what's the interference, that perhaps might be understood better, or felt through, so I mean, it's a feeling issue, it's a thought issue, but it's really a feeling issue, to be able to kind of work through and get at a level of curiosity that can really kind of push through some of these issues.
I guess could I just jump off that really quickly? I know this is an MSW program, so I think that part of we're talking about this in the context of like the therapeutic environment or like the therapeutic setting. Not everyone's going to be in that kind of setting, and not everyone's going to have that kind of setting. And so some of the approaches, the way that we're talking about it, I think can be used in any setting. But I think the piece that might be different is your timing. Right, you might not have a nicely carved out 45 to 50-minute session every week, right? So it is. You can still take some of the skills or the way of kind of the way to contextualize or conceptualize certain experiences in any setting, but you adapt it to what your setting is. I mean, so if there are specific questions there, I guess maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity to open it up for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat or unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Stephanie. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jillian, for moderating. So I am a new student and new to the field of social work. And I was doing a kind of social problem paper, and I chose to focus on trans rights for students, like specifically in schools. And this is a very particular thing that I went through, and also it's a very macro kind of thing. But I guess my question would be, what I found was like, oh, it's not legal to discriminate against trans people on a federal level, but then there exists kind of state laws that totally counteract. So I discovered that I don't know how government works, first of all. And I guess second, my question though would be like, as social workers, like, what are some things that right now we can focus on to actually make it safe for trans and lesbian, gay, and young people, queer people in the world, like policies or anything that you think that are, out there right now that we should be maybe putting our weight behind, just to actually have real protections and real preventative measures.
I think that's a great question. Well, one, I would say, try to get yourself involved. I think in whatever way you can, or just like find what's out there. So for one, I know Trevor Project does a national survey every year, kind of assessing where LGBTQI identifying people land as far as access to quality care, an assessment on suicidality and perceptions of what's and of their experiences. And so it's quite a fascinating survey, but they do one every year. So the Trevor Project is a great resource. I laughed at your question about your statement that you don't know anything about government, not because of laughing at you, but because I actually felt struck by the same thing. There are points where I'm so flabbergasted by the things that I hear and I see that that counteract either policies or our expectations. So NASW, obviously, your students, so I think that would be a great place to start too. You can there is an LGBTQ chapter, New York City based, if you want to get started on the local level and see what's available there and advocacy and information and resources.
I think noticing where the oppression plays out,
Mm-hmm.
like looking at a university's admission kind of forms and seeing, do they have a box for for those who aren't male and those who aren't female? And if they don't have a box for alternatives, there are plenty of places that now have that, have room for other categories other than male and female. But I'm looking even at our own university and thinking that so far isn't the case, that you've got two boxes in the admissions form. And that, I think that would be great to kind of have an awareness of where the change efforts can take place. Like there are now at Fordham gender free bathrooms, I think, but that wasn't, I mean, in Lowenstein building, I think there's one, that's all gender, and that's on the 3rd floor, I'm thinking. I mean, if you go to most of the other floors, that I think they're kind of, that's not the case. So then, you can start to identify what are the areas that really speak to more macro efforts by looking at what we have here, or what kind of jumps off the page as being kind of like oppressive environments that we could really do something to make for change, that then would have an impact on our clients' feeling of safety and feeling like they really can kind of look further into internal kinds of issues. But I think that the macro and the micro are so intertwined, it becomes, what's really telling, I think, is just how powerful our role as social workers are, that we really look at all three, the micro, meso, and macro, to try to get an assessment of where change efforts might take place.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Stephanie. Thank you so much for your question. That was a great question. And we have another question in the chat from Zach. And he asked, can either of you provide some insight into the journey one should expect securing their CSAT, which is Certified Sex Addiction Therapist, in regards to working with the LGBTQIA+ population on both an individual basis as well as relationships?
I can't. I can't provide a kind of a pathway. There are kind of pathways. There are a lot of pathways of how you start to get additional certifications once you're done. And we have to be attentive to the fact that as social workers, we come into the field with an LMSW, and you may stay with an LMSW, or you may start to work through your job, and through your experience to getting an LCSW and getting certifications that might support that in the field. But I don't know exactly the pathing for that.
Yeah, I don't know either an exact trajectory for that. However, there are institutes or separate institutes or certification places that will train you. Some are more costly than others. I think don't quote me on this, but I think it's called AASECT, AASECT or something like that. A quick Google search, you can probably find it. Or if anyone, you have my contact, you can email me and I can send you over. But they have a lot of information on what you could look into as far as what would be a good path for you, if that's a direction you want to go, and get certified in that area. But there's some, and some of them are nationally certified, some of them are locally. So I don't know. I don't want to promote just one in particular, but I just wanted to offer that as a possibility, as a place to start to kind of research a little, and if that's a direction you want to go.
Thank you. And if we have any other questions, we can put that in the chat, or people can unmute.
Hi, I do have a question, if you don't mind. My name is Dean Adams, and thank you guys for doing this. This was really great. I just wanted to ask about, how do we begin to address the issues within the community? So obviously we face discrimination outside of the non-queer folk, but how do we begin to address and uproot the issues of like racism and the extreme vanity and like toxic masculinity? Because I feel like our community is like breaking away from the norm, right? The traditional norm that we had, throughout generations. And I feel like it's just beginning again, right? There's that, like that model figure of like white gay men who are masculine are praised, where femininity and people of color are not. So how do we uproot that before it begins all over again? If that makes sense.
In fact, I was thinking of
total sense.
Go ahead, Nick. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was thinking of that as I was speaking about 25 minutes ago. I was thinking, this would be a great opportunity for me to talk about, this issue of racism within the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community as being essential, that we really focus in on it with an anti-racism kind of sentiment, and what are the tools that we use? I mean, there are lots of there are lots of attempts to do so, but I think recognition that this is a problem, that oppression exists within our communities, within the LGBT communities, and that we need to take an activist stance to kind of look at it and deal with it. I think that's so important,
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, your question's a lofty one. I wish we can wish we can solve it in one discussion. But I think that it is a very important issue, and it does come up in sessions. I recently, I read an article about intraminority stress, which essentially is a stress within the community with which you identify. It's quite lengthy, pretty dense, but has a lot of interesting information. But when I think combating it, there are tons of advocacy groups, I think too, that are out there that do support these kind of paying attention to our narratives. You see that there are people, at least in my experience, who experience racism, genderism, and so on within like apps and stuff, dating apps, sex apps, and everything. That it does play a big role in how people feel about themselves. I have I'm not even a client, but I have a friend who, who's told me quite a bit about things he's experienced within the community that make him feel devalued and less than. So I think as social workers, it is our part to try to address those things when we can, as we can, in our personal lives, and when and where and how you feel safe to do so. I think aligning yourself with the same people who are doing something similar, or trying to make that active change and active effort. But I think you raised a really good point, because this is about this does come up a lot with my clients in our sessions, and how they, in feeling marginalized within a community, they feel like they should not feel marginalized, or communities of people where they shouldn't. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you both.
Thank you. And Stephanie also asked Professor Santo if you could possibly put that article title in the chat, if that's okay. And we have another question from Casey as well. She asked, can you talk about how you'd like to see services become more accessible to LGBT identifying clients, and what barriers you notice come up in your sessions?
Well, I'm particularly of interest in how do you make a trans setting. Like when I go to I've been going to the doctor lately a lot, because I've been having this problem with my leg and it's been driving me nuts. But I go to the doctor's office and I'm wondering how a trans person negotiates some medical settings, that are very potentially off-putting and devaluing. And so it's like you got to notice these things, and do something to, as a medical practitioner, to really make your environment, validating, and I think that goes for us as clinical social workers in private practice is how do you make a space that feels very safe, and that you start to kind of really get inquisitive about issues that really could counter that, that sense of feeling safe to bring up topics that are not brought up in other areas. I think that's, kind of important, to, an opportunity to really start to think about these issues. I'll stop there.
Are you muted?
I wanted to expand on Casey's question. Many social workers will end up working in organizational settings. I think David and Nick have been talking a lot about private clinical practice, but many social workers will end up working in organizations where, and Nick, you mentioned earlier, homeless shelter setting, or a foster care setting, or, residential treatment, or what, there will be many settings that are where LGBT people will be. And if you as a social worker see that the organization is not accessible, welcoming, open, competent to deal with people, what do you do?
Well, I mean, I mean, there are attempts made to really change that. It's abounding. I mean, one of the tapes I show in my LGBT class is called Gen Silent, which talks elder, kind of the elders who are going back into care, who are oftentimes going back into the closet, and there are training programs at nursing homes and assisted living and settings, from at every level of meso kind of functioning, which really are attempting to make to really confront that, to find ways of being of kind of unpacking that kind of level of devaluation, and kind of bringing it out of how you might provide good care, as a part of an organization that may have a history of not, it's kind of like, you have a history of not providing value and care to your LGBT elders or LGBT people, so how do you start to kind of rethink that, or reframe that, and bringing in people to really to make those questions visible, like, how is our organization not creating a supportive environment for trans individuals or for gays and lesbians, and what can we do to make a difference, to make that not the case. And I think that's a task for as an organizational issue, that's a wonderful task to kind of see how can we make an environment that's really going to work for LGBT individuals. And part of it is really noticing and getting inquisitive about what isn't working, and how does your trans person perceive the doctor's office, which is so devaluing perhaps, and making a kind of a shift in the environment so that isn't the case. And in larger settings as well, that could be the case, is how you can really have training to really kind of make a shift in what you provide for your LGBTQI individuals, seems to me.
Yeah, just when I worked in the shelter, that's essentially kind of what happened. Like it was brought to our attention, and it came to the table for a discussion, not just with like supervisors. I mean, I was an entry-level social worker at that point when I was there, and so they didn't include just like management and supervisors in this discussion. Actually, they included the entire staff in the discussion in trying to like, how will we move forward in an approach that's both affirmative and trained staff also, and I think they did a really good job, I think, as far as that goes. I quit 6 months later, unrelated. So I don't know what happened with it, but I do know they made efforts. And so if you have the people speaking up and bringing attention to it and going to the right people, I think you make the efforts that you can. Sometimes that will work, and sometimes it won't.
Thank you so much to everyone for your questions. We only have a couple minutes left, but if anybody has like one last question, we might be able to answer that quickly. Like I said, you could put it in the chat or unmute.
I just wanted to, I saw the movie Born to Be recently. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a beautiful film, and it's about a Dr. Jess Ting, Mount Sinai Center, who is, I guess, one of the only centers, runs one of the only centers in the country that's doing transgender surgery. And I think, for this whole community who's watching this here, that film is very enlightening. It's beautiful. It really shows you kind of what, you know, the experience of transgender people, what they're feeling, not even feeling like this is their body. And I just think, you know, those kinds of films also, you know, are really important, actually. And the fact that there is one center, I mean, maybe there's more since this is done in the whole country, is shocking to me, you know, doing this kind of work. So that's, you know, just a comment more than anything, unless you have thoughts.
Mount Sinai has really been like kind of in the leading edge of that. So yeah. Actually, the client I spoke about earlier gets all their care there. And so I've had positive feedback and positive information about Mount Sinai.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that film with us. Maybe could you put it in the chat as well? That would be great. And I also wanted to mention too, before we wrap up, that like we said, this is a student Congress event, and we want to also give a shout out that if you are interested in working, like any of the students who are here are interested in working on issues at Fordham around LGBTQ plus support and advocacy, Student Congress is a great way to get involved. We have 4 different committees, and one of them is the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Anti-Racism Committee. So that would be an excellent committee to join to get more involved in those issues. And you can feel free to email us if you are interested in getting involved. Our email's in the chat. Yep, Professor Koch.
Yeah, also we have a Rainbow Collective here at Fordham, which focuses in on, it's just beginning. And so we're sort of in the process of working out what that will include. And so if you're interested in the Rainbow Collective, that is a affinity group or a valuing group of allies and those involved in the LGBT community, or anything else for that matter. You can reach out to me at koch@fordham.edu, and I'll be glad to reach out back and talk to you about issues of, you know, that you're interested in. You know, as simple as maybe you're doing a paper for a class and you just want to kind of toss around ideas, or something more complicated. But I'd be very happy to talk to anyone who is, you know, who wants to, and sort of, it's, you know, I find it very interesting and find it fun, engaging, you know, to have conversations about these issues, you know, that are so timely right now.
Thank you so much to Professors Santo and Koch. We really appreciate you being here today. And I feel like, I know I learned a lot. I'm sure we all learned a lot. Thank you to everyone for your questions as well. We really appreciate that. Hannah, if you're still there, did you want to wrap up with anything, or Nancy?
Well, I mean, I had a fun time. I hope there was some sense of it communicating, you know, but this is, what I think is really great is that this is a great field. You know, that LGBT clinical social work is a great field, and really needs really needs individuals who can really kind of come into it and muck it around and, you know, kind of learn from it and push it. You know, and I think that there's things to be done. You know, there are things done that really, you know, speak to both the micro and the meso level, as well as macro for that matter, you know. And I think we as clinical social workers, or as social workers, you know, anytime that we can get involved in pushing the needle in terms of LGBT social work, that's really a good thing. It's a social good to really make for lives that are different because of us, you know.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.